Passing is the title of both Nella Larsen's 1929 novella and director Rebecca Hall's 2021 film adaptation thereof. It tells the story of Irene Redfield, a light-skinned black woman who chances upon a childhood friend, Claire Ballou, who, although also black, is light-complected enough to pass as white.
Things aren't always what they seem.
I'll be damned.
Although Irene occasionally passes as white for purposes of convenience and practicality, Claire lives her entire life as a white woman and is even married to a wealthy white man named John, who is not shy about airing his racist views.
So you dislike Negroes, Mr. Bellew?
No, not at all. I hate them.
And with whom she has a daughter. Irene is an anxious and therefore cautious person who only passes in situations where she can remain anonymous, and she finds herself both in wonder of and deeply troubled by Claire's nonchalant and cavalier attitude when it comes to crossing the color line. A good deal of the narrative suspense is driven by Irene's afflicted fascination with Claire, whose beauty is matched only by her impulsive selfishness. In this sense, the two are foils, characters who are largely defined by their contrast. A great deal of both the novel and film revolves around the advantages, threats, and costs of racial passing.
Why, to get the things I want so badly, I'd do anything. Hurt anybody. Throw anything away.
However, there are also numerous oblique references to other kinds of passing, especially with regards to sexual orientation.
We're all of us passing for something or other. Aren't we?
While both characters are married, both exhibit some degree of unsatisfaction in their marriages. Although Irene yearns for stability and is devoted to her husband and family, there are hints that her husband, Brian Redfield, is somewhat unsatisfied with the sexual side of their relationship, and perhaps so is Irene.
Sex isn't a joke. What is it? What is a joke?
In the novel, the two have separate bedrooms, although they share a bed in the film. In the film, it is less so Brian than Irene who seems conflicted about her mixed sexual desires. She sometimes embraces him lovingly and at other times gently rejects his advances. Additionally, and although Brian is a successful black doctor, he is deeply frustrated with the racism which permeates life in the United States and thinks that their family would be better off moving abroad. Especially in Larsen's novel, Irene spends a substantial amount of mental energy fretting over the possibility that Brian will either uproot their family or leave her and abscond to South America. When Claire and Brian strike up a friendship, Irene begins to suspect that they are having intimate relations and worries that the two might elope. Especially if Claire's husband learns that she has been lying to him about her racial heredity.
Have you ever thought of what you'd do if John found out?
Yes.
Claire finds herself similarly unsatisfied, although for somewhat different reasons. Unlike Irene, Claire does not pass for short periods of time, but lives her entire life as a white woman, and during a historical period in which racial violence was quite common. Thus, when Claire insinuates herself into Irene's life and becomes a recurring figure in the social world of the predominantly black district of Harlem, Irene becomes increasingly concerned for Claire's safety.
I'm beginning to believe that no one is ever completely happy for your sake.
Well, then what does it matter if I come up here sometimes?
You have a child, Claire. It's not just a matter of your safety.
While passing has undoubtedly allowed Claire to attain a higher level of material advantage and social status, the price of this rise has been her total and complete isolation from the black community and life ways of her childhood. Claire thus finds herself at once elevated and isolated, advantaged and deeply alienated, all at the same time.
You can't imagine. Without that day, I would have got to the end unable to speak to anyone. You can't know. Never anyone to really talk to.
It is an internal conflict which Irene and others who know Claire's secret often struggle to comprehend.
Yeah. It's normal. They always come back.
Why? They have to work so hard at getting there. Why would they want to come back?
If I knew that, I'd know what race is.
You think they'd be satisfied being white?
It is also an internal conflict which is deeply wrapped up with questions of domesticity, fidelity to family, and the gendered roles they reinforce. roles which Irene relishes and clings to as a source of security, but which seem to burden or even imprison the more free-spirited Claire.
I think being a mother is the cruelest thing in the world.
Yes. And the most responsible.
Indeed, it is precisely this responsibility to her daughter which Irene believes would constrain Claire and keep her from traversing the color line back into the black community from which Claire had long previously fled. But it is also this dedication to the forms of domesticity and family which would seem to hold Irene back from coming to grips with the nature of her repressed attraction to Claire. Or is this just another way of passing, fooling not only the social world, but herself as well?
We're all of us passing for something or other.
How are such questions negotiated differently in the case of Larsen's prose novel as opposed to Hall's film? What can we learn about both passing and adaptation from setting the two alongside each other? In this video essay, I will investigate the ways in which social practices of passing on the one hand and creative practices of adaptation on the other intersect in the case of Nella Larsen's novel and Rebecca Hill's film adaptation. I will present a reading of the relationship between source text and adaptation which argues not for the slavish subordination of a perceived cinematic imitation to a presumably authentic novelistic origin, nor for the case of a novelistic story detaching itself from its outdated print medium and, quote, passing into the more popular and lucrative realm of cinema, but which instead attends to the proliferation of interpretive and creative possibilities generated from the intertextual engine set in motion at the nexus between the two texts. Before we begin, however, it is worth taking a moment to discuss the practice of passing as an activity rife with social, cultural, political, and emotional consequences. As Alison Hobbs writes in A Chosen Exile, a study of racial passing, the practice is not just a way of crossing the color line undetected to grain racialized advances, but also is a form of exile, sometimes chosen, sometimes not, to quote Hobbes. She goes on to explain that both the practice and study of passing, quote, requires a reckoning with the loss, alienation, and isolation that accompanied and often outweighed its rewards, end quote. In this sense, passing is not just about subverting the color line. That is to say, a practice of resistance, rebellion, and even ridicule for the nonsensical absurdities inherent in notions of racial purity, but also a practice laden with social and psychological consequences. Practices of passing, thus, to quote Hobbes again, reveal how race operates, not only as it is imposed from without, but also as it is experienced from within. To pass as white means to lose a sense of embeddedness in a community or a collectivity. Passing reveals that the essence of identity is not found in an individual's qualities, but rather in the way that one recognizes oneself and is recognized as kindred. These forms of recognition may begin with superficial markers such as skin color, speech, and dress, but these are only indicators of associative relations, ways of being in the world, and an imagined sharing of a common origin and iconic experiences. End quote.
My grandma, she was half Turk, half black. My grandpa was a white man. My mom registered me as black. My mom she wasn't as fair complected as I am. She was a light tan brown. My dad, he has German, Irish, white. Well, his mother was a white woman. His dad was a colored man. And then as I grew older and I got married and I had my children, I registered my children as black.
Passing is thus a cultural practice deeply entangled with notions of fidelity and infidelity, as well as escape and abandonment.
My grandmother didn't want me to call, but I did anyway. From her perspective, it was sort of like, well, they left us, so why should we reach out?
While passing can, in one sense, unmask the very notion of racialized differentialization as a ruse, society's deep investments in that ruse mean that being found out can have dire consequences. For example, Claire's ability to pass as white is surely a form of self-preservation. After all, who knows what would happen to her and her daughter should her husband and the social world to which he belongs discover that she is black. But it is also burdened by notions of dissemblance, likely to be regarded as dishonest, an act of infidelity, betrayal, even treason, and liable, therefore, to result in violence.
What the devil is the matter?
You get to tell me what to do. You have to calm down.
I don't
Any
know
of you
what
people.
think. At best, you leave.
You liar!
Careful. You're the only white man here.
Dirty liar.
From Claire's perspective, passing is a way of rising in a racist world, but it also requires a form of social isolation which makes her increasingly miserable. It is possible to read the practice of passing as a way of turning one's back on one's roots, of betraying one's heritage and losing the things which bind a person to their own past, family relations, as well as culture. Passing can arouse longing for the things left behind, such as food, conversation, music, and other cultural practices. In this sense, as Alison Hobb puts it, quote, "Some African Americans used passing as a crucial channel, leading to physical and personal freedom. They declared their rights as American citizens and insisted on their humanity. What they could not fully know, until they had successfully passed, was that the light of freedom was often overshadowed by the darkness of loss." Adaptation is a creative practice of media translation which, like passing, is often beleaguered by questions of fidelity. Due to a long-standing, if often implicit, cultural hierarchy which adjudicates the value of cinematic adaptations of literary objects on the grounds of their ability to stay, quote, true to the source text, judgments of how successful or unsuccessful any adaptation may be are often wrapped up with questions of fidelity and infidelity. In this sense, the common knee-jerk tendency to judge adaptations based upon how well they are perceived to stay true to an original work after traversing mediums seems to evoke a rhetoric of infidelity and dissemblance which suggests an ethical valence similar to that deployed in condemnations or critiques of passing. As Thomas Light puts it in Adaptation and Its Discontents, quote, "Studies of adaptation tend to privilege literature over film in two ways. By organizing themselves around canonical authors, they establish a presumptive criterion for each new adaptation. By arranging adaptations as spokes around the hub of such a strong authorial figure, they establish literature as a proximate cause of adaptation that makes fidelity to the source text central to the field." End quote. Of course, this way of adjudicating the value of adaptations is severely limiting for several reasons. To begin with, the translation of a story from the printed page to another medium will necessitate inevitable changes. Different media have different affordances. Put simply, things they can and can't do, and this has consequences. Various forms of interior or omniscient narration made possible by printed prose are difficult to reproduce in film. Translating interior thoughts and feelings into voice-overs or in monologues which break the fourth wall in a film can be distracting, and is often used to generate comedic rather than naturalistic effects.
You made me ask twice. Is the mask muffling my voice?
As a result, we often rely upon the nuanced performances of actors or actresses to give us a sense of the interior motivations or feelings of characters, and the lighting, editing, and other choices of cinematographers, rather than narration to convey a sense of style or mood. Put it another way, those things become the form of narration, as opposed to prose. Indeed, adaptation is not a simple process of reenacting the events of a novel with actors, but is instead a creative and often cooperative effort, which brings together a host of intentions, strategies, and creative choices which far exceed that of the director or author on their own. Films, after all, are not simply the products of singular genius authors, but rely on the coordinated work of large crews and casts. They may be guided by the overall vision of a director or auteur, but that vision itself is tempered and informed by an innumerable number of micro-choices made by everyone from set designers, costumers, grips, editors, actors, and so on. Thus, some have argued that it makes more sense to treat cinematic adaptations on their own terms, rather than expecting them to remain as faithful as possible to source materials or the presumed intentions of writers. Of course, in some cases, a certain percentage of audience members may not even be aware that what they are watching is an adaptation at all, or of the extent to which a film is reliant upon a prior work may be a matter of contention. Certainly, many fans who know that Francis Ford Coppola's Apocalypse Now is based upon a politically charged reimagining of Joseph Conrad's novel Heart of Darkness likely watched the film before they were even aware that the novel existed. And many of those likely never bothered to pick up a copy of Conrad's novel at all, let alone read it. Strict chronology, the fact that Conrad's novel appeared before Apocalypse Now, takes a back seat to a more widespread cultural cinephilia in such cases. Such is very likely the case also with Passing, insofar as Nella Larsen's novel is less likely to be included in the canon composed of high school reading lists, rather than other more traditional texts. And all but the most committed literature nerds are more likely to have watched Hall's film than read Larsen's novel. Indeed, to a certain degree, not only film adaptations, but all works of culture are radically intertextual. That is, they inherit and are indebted to works that came before them, and they interact with other works as they inform the creation of still more works of art. For example, it is generally believed that West Side Story is based on Shakespeare's Romeo and Juliet, but few people know that Shakespeare relied upon a prior set of source materials, including, but not limited to, the much less famous 1562 narrative poem by Arthur Brooke. That is to say that while it is common to think of cinematic adaptations as supplements or pale shadows of presumably original works of literature, it is probably more accurate to think of all works of art as nodes in intertextual networks. That is, products which connect to others in various overlapping and often surprising ways, and this opens up endless possibilities not only for interpretation, but for creative work as well. What this in turn implies is that notions of fidelity or infidelity to an original source text are not terribly helpful in terms of analysis, and perhaps even constraining in terms of creativity. Or, as Julie Sanders puts it in Adaptation and Appropriation, quote, "It is at the very point of infidelity or departure that the most creative acts of adaptation take place." End quote. This more promiscuous approach to adaptation upsets the notion that fidelity to source material is the pinnacle value and aim of cinematic adaptations. Not only can we judge adaptations on their own terms, but they can even offer us the opportunity for more creative engagement, opening up the horizons of valid and interesting observations, interpretations, and even entirely new adaptations and creations of their own. As Leitch puts it, quote, "No story, of course, is the whole story. Readers and viewers always complete the stories they think they are merely consuming." End quote. To return to the case of Passing, it is illuminating to consider the various ways in which Rebecca Hall's adaptation puts questions of fidelity and infidelity to the test. It is generally agreed that the film is a cinematic and creative success, although there is no doubt that there is plenty of talk going on around dinner tables, in classrooms, and on the internet as to whether or not it lives up, falls short, or exceeds the achievement of Larsen's novel. Discourses which reproduce the assumption that fidelity should be the central question when evaluating an adaptation. More interesting, however, is to consider the ways in which the thematization of various forms of fidelity and the ways in which Hall's creative strategies result not only in reductions, omissions, or distortions of the source work, but rather act as transmedia expansions which enrich our understanding. Consider, for example, Hall's choice to shoot her film in black and white. Of course, this is a creative choice to which novels do not generally have access, with the exception, of course, of graphic novels. And thus these choices are made possible only in the deployment of a visual medium. In this sense, it makes little sense to ask if this creative choice is true to the novel or not. On the other hand, it does mimic to some degree the colors of black print on a white or off-white page. And no doubt, the choice makes sense given the historical moment of racial segregation, the thematization on racial passing, and the critiques of racism as both ideologically absurd and materially powerful which result. As director Rebecca Hall herself has noted, quote, "The irony of black and white films is they're gray. There's nothing black or white about it, ever." End quote. The use of black and white film also intersects with the issue of casting. While Tessa Thompson and Ruth Negga, the actresses who play Irene and Claire respectively, are of mixed-race parentage, neither are so light-skinned that they would have successfully passed for white in 1920s America. However, by shooting the movie in black and white, Hall is able to cast the two brilliant and successful black actresses in roles which have been historically played by women who identified as white in earlier instances of film dealing with passing, such as Douglas Sirk's 1959 adaptation of Fannie Hurst's 1933 novel of the same name, in which Susan Conner plays the role of Sarah Jane, a black girl who passes for white.
I'm somebody else. I'm white. White. White! Does that answer you?
I guess so.
Then please, Mama, will you go? And never do this again.
In this sense, the adaptation flaunts its infidelity towards longer cinematic traditions in which white actresses get head billing for playing black characters. This infidelity to a suspect cinematic tradition becomes instead a moment of expanded opportunity for black talent previously relegated to secondary supporting roles in films about passing. Moreover, pairing this choice of actresses with this choice of black and white film provokes consideration of the role colorism plays in communities of color in general and in Hollywood casting in particular. It's also worthwhile to consider Irene's conflicted feelings towards Claire. Is Irene erotically attracted to Claire? Is she passing as heterosexual in much the same way as Claire is passing for white? This possibility is intimated but never directly stated in either the novel or the film. It is also, however, never simply evaded. Instead, homoerotic desire is coded in subtle ways into the subtext of the novel, allowing Nella Larson to deal with themes of homoerotic desire or sexual orientation at a moment when such talk was taboo. Thus, we might read Irene's fixation on the stability of her family life, as well as her evident discomfort discussing themes of racialized violence or sexuality, as a way of evading or suppressing her own fears and desires. In this sense, Irene's fear that Brian is cheating on her with Claire may be read as unsubstantiated paranoia manifesting as a form of psychological displacement, in which Irene projects her own repressed feelings for Claire onto Brian. In any event, the film and the novel both actively generate these suspicions and hold them in a state of unresolved tension, albeit in different ways. The prose of Larson's novel activates the suspicion by describing Irene's sense of being drawn involuntarily towards Claire, of finding her beautiful, even though she also finds her behavior insufferable. Consider the following passage. Quote, "She meant to tell Claire Kendry at once, and definitely, that it was no use her coming. But that was as far as she got in her rehearsal, for Claire had come softly into the room without knocking, and, before Irene could greet her, had dropped a kiss on her dark curls. Looking at the woman before her, Irene Redfield had a sudden, inexplicable onrush of affectionate feeling. Reaching out, she grasped Claire's two hands in her own, and cried with something like awe in her voice, 'Dear God, but aren't you lovely, Claire?'" End quote. The film also gestures towards these internal emotions and effects, although the subtext of Larson's prose is translated into subtle gestures, facial expressions, and vocal tones of the actors, as well as other cinematic effects.
Darn it, the truth is, I'm very glad to see you, Claire. Very.
Sorry. Hey. I'm asking, why wouldn't you?
Who's to say I'm not?
The cinematic medium lends itself towards a focus on subtle bodily gestures, vocal clues, camera angles, and other forms of tonality, whereas the novel must create this indeterminacy by describing, but never fully dwelling on, flickering moments of desire. Neither the film nor the novel clearly confirm Irene's suspicion of infidelity, nor do they release Irene's repressed desire to cross the line of erotic taboo. However, the extension of this ambiguity from one medium to the other only highlights the audience's sense of the stakes involved in these moments of hesitation and holding back. And it is precisely such moments of hesitation, of holding in one's secret thoughts as well as holding back one's most furtive desires and fears, which leads directly to the indeterminacy and uncertainty at the heart of the story's climax. Consider the carefully choreographed confusion surrounding the moment Claire falls out the window during the climax of both the novel and the film. Claire's husband John, having crossed paths with Irene in a black neighborhood and in the company of other black people, realizes that Claire has been deceiving him about her roots and barges in on a party in a fit of anger. In the novel, we are made explicitly aware of Irene's growing sense of paranoia and jealousy directed towards Claire. Larson writes, quote, "Surely she was going mad with fear and suspicion. She must not work herself up. She must not. Where were all the self-control, the common sense that she was so proud of? Now, if ever, was the time for it." End quote. In the film, we also see this at work, although much more minutely. We need to pay more attention to Tessa Thompson's acting to become aware of it, and we need to read between the lines of the dialogue which ensue between Claire, Irene, and Brian.
What is it, Rainey?
Have you ever thought of what you'd do if John found out?
Yes.
Don't fall by the wayside before the fourth floor. I absolutely refuse to carry anybody up more than 2 flights.
And? What would you?
I do what I want more than anything right now. I come up here to live. In Harlem. With you.
In the novel, even Irene isn't sure exactly what occurs when Claire falls from the window to her death. Quote, "Claire stood at the window, as composed as if anyone were not staring at her, as if the whole structure of her life were not lying in fragments before her. She seemed unaware of any danger or uncaring. There was even a faint smile on her full red lips and in her shining eyes. It was that smile that maddened Irene. She ran across the room, her terror tinged with ferocity, and laid a hand on Claire's bare arm. One thought possessed her. She couldn't have Claire Kendry cast aside by Bellew. She couldn't have her free." What happened next, Irene Redfield never afterwards allowed herself to remember, never clearly. One moment Claire had been there, a vital glowing thing, like a flame of red and gold. The next, she was gone. Did Claire jump in an act of defiance or despair at being found out? Did Irene, seeing a moment of opportunity, push her out the window? Was this an accident? Was it intentional? Was it an act of fugitivity on Claire's part? A final escape from the captivity John represents? Or an act of treason? A betrayal on the part of Irene meant to ensure the security of her marriage to Brian? Or perhaps even to rid herself of her own sexual attraction to Claire? In the film, it is equally ambiguous as to what exactly happens in the scuffle. When Irene's arm shoots out and presses against Claire, is this an instinctual act of shielding a friend? Or an opportune act of violence? Is it some perverse combination of both? No single interpretation of this climactic event seems sufficient, and it seems clear that the ambiguity is totally intentional.
Should I go down?
No, it's nothing.
Indeed, we might even question the vague, reductive interpretation offered by the police officer at the end of the film.
Death by misadventure, I'm inclined to believe. Let's go up and have a look at that window.
If Passing is a story of misadventure, its tragedy arises from the context of a social and political world which fails to be sufficiently expansive to accommodate the desires of all the characters living in it. If Claire or Irene are tragic figures, it is not because of hubris or jealousy, but because the world they live in is far too confined by racial hierarchies, gender domesticity, and sexual taboo to allow them to realize both their need for security and the depths of their desires. The novel and the film offer us somewhat different interpretations of the same narrative event, yet it would be wrong to assert the novel's rendition is somehow, quote, truer than the film, simply because one predates the other. If we instead resist the urge to pass judgment on the film for somehow failing to faithfully reproduce the novel, we can begin to read these two works not as competing renditions, but as parts of the same dynamic system, mutually illuminating extensions, or texts contextualizing one another. Irene's interior confusion in the novel is not diminished, but rather enriched by the film's intentionally confusing editing, shunting the possibility of any single or authoritative vantage point. In the final analysis, many possible readings of motivation appear simultaneously, each reading equally valid and each ultimately insufficient on its own. It's precisely these moments of indeterminacy wherein the very notion of fidelity collapses in on itself. The proliferation of possible interpretations instead constitutes a final escape from hermeneutic capture and the value-laden fealties they would seem to imply. Adaptation, therefore, appears not as a matter of staying true to or departing from a source text, but rather as an act of radical ambiguity and thus creative proliferation. Similarly, the practice of passing appears as a complex, rich phenomenon which cannot be reduced to simple notions of subversion, repression, infidelity, or betrayal. Attending closely to the complex, irreducible meanings produced by practices of passing and adaptation, therefore works to unsettle any presumed set of hierarchical value relations. Instead, these activities constantly evade interpretive capture, escaping any attempts to lock in settled interpretations or final judgments, and thereby appear as radically fugitive undertakings in and of themselves.